Hello and welcome to Good Evening Britain, a Force for Good's weekly show, coming to you live from our studios here in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow, with me, your host, Alistair McConnachie. We are broadcasting on all our digital platforms throughout the United Kingdom and across the world. We're bringing you quality, pro-UK comment and analysis every Wednesday from 7 until 8 p.m. on Facebook, on YouTube, on X, and also on TikTok. Folks, we have got a packed show for you this evening. I'm pleased to say that we have a guest on at 7:30. It's our good friend from across the pond, Avellina Balestri, who's going to be talking again about the 1745 conflict, and in particular the Battle of Prestonpans, what that was all about. And she's going to focus on a major character of that particular battle and his unfortunate fate. That's at 7:30. Before then, a lot to talk about in the news today and, of course, in the past week. And we've headed this particular program, is the SNP imploding? Because goodness me, there seem to be more people leaving the party than joining, and especially MSPs who are currently MSPs and who are not going to be standing again, including virtually all of the big hitters. So I have a little bit of hay fever tonight. I think I'm going to get through the program, absolutely, but needs must, as they say. We are professionals. We rise to the challenge of bringing you quality content every week if we possibly can. So we're not going to let that stop us. Let's say hello to one or two people who have come in so far. Derek was first on the scene. He says, "Good evening, everyone. A nice August evening, isn't it? Although you're back at work, no longer watching the shenanigans on Bothwell Street, if you know what I'm talking about, as in the filming of the Spider-Man movie that I know you were posting about the other night, Derek. Hope you enjoyed that day out." Hello to Exiled Viking, who says, "Good evening." And to Paul, who comes straight in fighting with "Enough is enough, stop the boats." Absolutely. Well, we are going to be stopping the boats to as much as we possibly can anyway with our new book, Protect Our Country, a big book for the Union, Volume 2. It's all about enough is enough. It's all about stopping the boats. More about that later in the show. Hello to Catherine from Glasgow, and to Ian. Nice to see Ian. "Given the state of their opponents," says Ian, "the SNP could implode utterly and still fail." By which you mean still form the government. Yes, I knew you meant that. Good evening to Debbie and to Christopher and to Anthony. Anthony, I hope you've got the book now. Please tell me you have. Christopher says, "Hang in there with the hay fever. I feel your pain." Yes, well, could the SNP still win even though they are in an absolute state of affairs? Let's just look at that. Kate Forbes, this week, was it yesterday, in fact, put out this message on Twitter. And she said, "After careful thought over recess, I've decided not to seek re-election to the Scottish Parliament next year. I've written to the First Minister this morning. I will continue to serve the First Minister, the government, and my constituents to the best of my ability until May 2026. And she did indeed put out that letter as well, which I thought about reading, but quite frankly, it doesn't say anything of any note whatsoever. And it doesn't tell us why she has resigned. And believe, this person is, I had to just check, I had to Google it, but she is the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, which means she's like the second in command in Scotland. Now, if I was the second in command in Scotland, I'd be wanting to kind of hang on there. I'd be wanting to say, this is a pretty good position. I would like to continue being the second most important person in Scotland. So to give that up is kind of odd, I would have thought. I'm not saying that there's any real reason behind that. I don't know. Maybe it's just to spend more time with our family. But, you don't step down from stuff like that just because it's like, oh, I can do something better. Oh, yeah, what are you going to be? The only better thing you could be is like the First Minister. And everybody thought she was going to be the next First Minister, or at least the next leader of the SNP. But clearly she doesn't. Clearly her heart's not in it, because if her heart was in it, then she wouldn't be stepping down. Because I was wondering, is she in a constituency where, she's in trouble? And firstly, her constituency is, we'll just put the pick up of her constituency. It's, here we go. It's Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch. Isn't that funny? Skye, Lochaber and Kemi Badenoch. That's basically her constituency. And there it is in the slap bang there in the Highlands, including Skye, 76,000 people in 2019, which means if you add on the asylum seekers, today it's probably somewhere in the region of 250,000. I'm kidding, of course, but that's the constituency, Skye, Lochaber and Kemi Badenoch. And if we look at the result of the 2021 Scottish parliamentary election for Skye, Lochaber and Kemi Badenoch, Kate Forbes got 24,192, and in second place was a Conservative at 8,000. So it's not like Kate Forbes is being pressed there at all. That's an easy win again for her. And even when reform comes in next year, the SNP are still going to take that seat. So it can't be anything to do with that. So what's the reason? Does anybody have any ideas why she would want to stand down, why she would want to give up Deputy First Ministership? Especially at such a young age as well. We have to presume she's maybe just wanting to raise a family. Maybe that's all it is. But it is a bit kind of crazy, really, because for a while, she stood as a candidate for the leadership, didn't she? Who was she against? Was it against Humza Yousaf? And it's all a big thing, oh, who's going to win? And now she's just like, oh, do you know what? Can't be bothered. I'll just step down. Strange. It could just be that she realizes the game's a bogey. If I was in the SNP, I would think that as well. I'd just be like, you know what? Come back to this in 100 years or something like that. But for now, it's just a waste of energy. So let's look at all the MSPs who are standing down so far that we know about, the SNP MSPs. And that's a list that I compiled earlier today. And there's 22 MSPs there that we know about. The first 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. The first 12 in bold are the MSPs from the SNP that I've actually heard about. I've heard of Nicola Sturgeon, Humza Yousaf, Kate Forbes, Marie Gudgeon, or Gugion, I don't know, Michael Matheson, Annabelle Ewing, James Dornan, Christine Graham, Shona Robinson, Fiona Hislop, Richard Lockhead, and John Mason. We've all heard of them. As for the others, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. As for the other 10, I've never heard of them in my life. But they've been living high at my and your expense. Anyway, we're not going to be seeing any more of them, which is good news. It's like goodbye to them. So my own view is that, yeah, the SNP is probably imploding. Swinney, majority will pave way to Indy Ref 2. What he means by that, and this is a report from last week's Daily Telegraph, 29th July. The First Minister said that the SNP winning an outright majority at Holyrood should be good enough to force Sir Keir Starmer to drop his opposition to allowing a vote on separation. And so by winning an outright majority there, what he means is winning most of the seats. There's 129 seats at the Scottish Parliament. To win an outright majority, you need to have, in your party, you need to have 65 of those seats. And Swinney says that if they get 65 seats, then that should somehow be enough to force a second referendum. And in a sense, he makes the point, which is difficult to gainsay, in that a precedent has been set at the 2011 Scottish election when Alex Salmond led the SNP to a majority win, and then Prime Minister David Cameron authorised a referendum. However, precedents can be thrown out, and I would strongly urge that we throw out that particular precedent. And it's not really appropriate anyway, because it doesn't symbolize a nation that really, really wants independence. And back in our very first book, One Big Country, a Big Book for the Union, Volume 1, we explained what the SNP would need to do to genuinely get a mandate. And for all those Scottish National Party people watching who want me to tell them, I'm going to have to say, no, you're going to have to pay $9.99 for the book. But in this book, we do explain from historic precedent how a political party does actually get a mandate for a split, democratically speaking. We run through all the options and we show you the one that it actually is. You can get this by just going onto Amazon and searching for One Big Country. And so it's most certainly not getting 65 seats at a Holyrood election, despite what David Cameron, in his lack of constitutional knowledge, ended up giving them. Now, this differs from Nicola Sturgeon's approach. Nicola Sturgeon, remember her, she said that if the SNP and the Greens and Alba together got 65 seats, then that would be sufficient. That was an even weaker mandate than what Swinney is suggesting, which is that the mandate has to be the SNP themselves getting the 65 seats. However, it's been greeted with some degree of scepticism, even among their own ranks. Alex Neil, a former Scottish Health Secretary, said backing for the SNP would have to increase by 50% in less than a year for the party to achieve a majority in this way, and this was, quote, almost impossible. Mr. Neil, who last month called for Mr. Swinney to be, quote, replaced immediately, said, to win an overall majority, the SNP would have to get about 45% of the vote. The SNP is currently at about 30% of the vote and has been stuck at that figure for some time. It's almost an impossible task for it to increase its vote share by 50% in the next 10 months, given the poor performance under Sturgeon, Youssef, and Swinney. He said Mr. Swinney's announcement was an attempt to silence his critics at the SNP conference. So, all the top people jumping ship, and even Swinney's attempt to silence his critics at the SNP conference is not being accepted. And Swinney has set himself a goal which even his most ardent supporters recognise is going to be very difficult to effect. And even if he got it, even if there was some miracle and he got 65 seats next year, he's still facing the fact that Keir Starmer has been, to his credit, pretty strong about not granting another referendum. Do I have a quote here first from Starmer? Keir Starmer insisted that a stronger Scotland would be better off within the strength of the United Kingdom, and he said it was time for Mr. Swinney to spend more time getting domestic politics right in Scotland rather than the Constitution. Absolutely. So they're under a lot of pressure. So now is the time. Now is the time to really push hard, which is what we try to do all the time here at A Force for Good, to not let up, to keep making the case, for our fantastic United Kingdom. Quite a few people making comments here. Stephen says, Forbes' reputation has been subject to hyperbole. Ian points out, the SNP's only interesting and halfway pleasant minister has quit. Indeed, there's a lot worse waiting in the wings. Christopher says, I think there is a lot of nasty infighting going on. She has had enough and also realises time is up for the SNP. As Stephen says, why should a majority of seats give a mandate for separatism when most don't consent to it? Indeed, you would probably find that when you added up the actual votes that the SNP got, there would still be more votes for all the other parties that are ostensibly for keeping the UK together. Ian says, it was David Cameron who set the precedent that a Holyrood majority gets a referendum. Indeed, referendums were not in its jurisdiction, and so a majority does not carry that mandate or even message. That's right. It's really the majority to be won is to be won at the Union Parliament, which is the Parliament and the jurisdiction which carries the power over that particular matter. As Stephen says here, under UK constitutional law, no party can get a mandate for separation from a devolved election. The mandate would have to be won at the level of the Union Parliament. That's one step that we do mention in our book, One Big Country. Only a majority, well, a type of majority at a UK general election, only a mandate can be found at a UK general election. I would say it wouldn't have to necessarily be, well, for more information, check out One Big Country. And as Paul says, we can't go round in circles forever. The reason for the 2014 referendum was to give us an answer. Now we're moving forward together. Absolutely. Let's move forward together. As Donald Trump, I think he said, he goes, is it quoted here? But Mr. Trump said he recalled, he's got a different recollection from me, but he recalled that the 2014 referendum was meant to settle the issue for 50 or 75 years. Quote, 50 or 75 years. That sounds good to me. That sounds good to me. I don't know if anybody actually ever said that at the time, but Donald has revised the history of it and come up with an even better plan, that what we actually meant was 75 years. Count me in. Can't we just go back to 2001 style Scottish Labour? I was fine with that, says Ian. Hi to Alan. Hi to Anthony. Thank you for sharing, Anthony, and anybody else watching tonight. If you're watching on Twitter, please give us a retweet. If you're watching on Facebook, please give us a share. If you're watching on YouTube, please give us a thumbs up and a follow. It really does help to get our message out. Lots of comments tonight. Alan says, got a couple of books on Amazon. Very good and very thoroughly researched. Good job. Fantastic. We're building up a library of books, and we've got 3 books. We've got 5 books, really more that we've got in our head, but we're going to get 1 book out before the end of the year, but it'll be a complete diversion. It won't be anything to do with either the Constitution or anything. It's going to be me on money, and that's going to come out before the end of the year. And then next year we'll get the 3rd volume on this one going. We could be in trouble if they get back in again, but you know what? If we get candidates from other parties, then it could actually stir things up a bit. So I'm hoping that we can get new blood in, which will really, really help. James is watching from Ireland tonight. Once in a lifetime, 80 years. Yeah, absolutely. Or 100 years. Let's make it 100 years. What with lifetimes increasing these days. Thank you, Christopher, who says, I bought a Kindle and a paper version of Volume 2. Looking forward to reading it. Well, everybody who's been reading it says that it really is something. Somebody called it a work of art, which I thought was just fantastic. Thank you very much for that. But it is a work of art, and it's like nothing you'll have ever read, because it's just solution after solution. And it's not, oh, aren't things awful? You know, some people, like, they get very successful by just complaining about how awful things are. We take that for read. This is just, how do we mend stuff? This is the route map to the solution for our clueless politicians, who will get a clue after they've seen this. Now, I mentioned there about a 3rd book that we're planning in our head at the moment that'll be out in about November. And it's going to be something, it's going to be a wee bit going back for me to stuff I was involved in back between 1999 and 2013, which was looking at the monetary system and how debt was exploding and how house prices were getting out of everybody's reach and why that was. And a lot of it is, of course, due to the way that money is created. And this is something that people never, that's really, I don't want to sound esoteric, but it is a sort of hidden knowledge. And is deliberately hidden because the reality makes some people a great deal of money. And I was thinking about that the other day, and I realized that tomorrow, 7th of August, is the 111th anniversary of something called the Bradbury pound. Now, on the 4th of August, 1914, World War was announced. At least Britain's war with Germany was announced. And what happened in the next 2 days was that there was a run on the banks. Everybody, or not everybody, but anybody with substantial money wanted to get the money out the banks because they were concerned that the banks were going to fail, and they wanted gold. Now, of course, The gold's not there to give people. So the government were faced with a crisis, and what could they do? And so the Secretary of the Treasury, a chap called James Bradbury, came up with the idea that what we'll simply do is give them paper. And it was called the Bradbury pound. And let's have a look. There it goes. These notes are a legal tender for a payment of any amount, issued by the Lords Commissioners of His Majesty's Treasury under authority of Act of Parliament. And it's signed there by John Bradbury, Secretary of the Treasury. And that's on the left there. There's a little emblazoned pic of the king at the time, which was George V. Okay. So how does the government of the day explain that? I found this explanation from the British Treasury today. Let's bring up that pick there. Freedom of Information Act, the Bradbury pound. The Bradbury pound was introduced in 1914 at the outbreak of the First World War. The government at the time needed to preserve its stock of bullion, so asked the Bank of England to cease paying out gold for its notes. Instead, the Treasury printed and issued 10 shilling and £1 notes, so-called Bradbury pounds. The gold standard was then partially restored in 1925, and the Bank of England was again obliged to exchange its notes for gold, but only in multiples of 400 ounces or more. Britain left the gold standard in 1931, and the note issue became entirely fiduciary, that is, wholly backed by securities instead of gold. Okay, what they mean there by fiduciary is basically backed by other pieces of paper. Because what happens today is if the government wants money, it prints what it calls securities, which are promises to pay the buyer whatever is denominated on that particular security, plus interest sometime in the future. So if the government wants to raise £1 million, it sells 1 million securities, it gets the £1 million in, but it's then indebted to give that £1 million back at some time in the future to the purchasers of these securities, plus interest. And that interest is what's called the national debt. And we actually talk about this in a chapter here. We've got a whole chapter on the markets and why the markets panic when they hear about immigration policies that they don't like. They panic. And why do they panic? And so on and so forth. And it's a very good explanation in that book. But I want to flesh that out in another document. And I want to just, before we bring on our guest in 2 or 3 minutes, I just want to say that the Bradbury pound was actually a very good idea because it was not backed by debt. It was simply government created money. The government didn't create the Bradbury pounds by selling Bradbury securities to anybody. It just said, we need £100 million or whatever the figure was. We need to get that into society because people are asking for their money. So they just printed the money debt free. There was nobody there was nobody that was purchasing the securities. It was just government created, or what I like to call publicly created, debt free money, which by its very nature of being debt free was also interest free. And that completely undermined the financiers and the financial system, because the financial system is built upon the whole idea that they lend to the government and the government gives them money in return with interest. So the Bradbury pound is a good idea, but the City of London basically put the kibosh on it and stopped that privately created debt-free money from being rolled out, as it were, in the years to come. But it's an answer to Britain's great level of indebtedness, because it's the financial system to whom we owe the debt. And for many of us, it's becoming intolerable, the way that money is created is becoming intolerable, and it's becoming an actual real problem. ATMs are dying out. You can bank on that. Fears for OAPs and rural communities over closures. 4 cash machines lost every week. From the Sunday Mail, 3rd of August. Now, what this is saying is that in these rural areas, you can't get access to cash. And the reason you can't get access to cash is these ATMs are run by the private banks, and it does not pay the private banks to have these ATMs in these areas where there's not that much business. But we need cash. People in rural areas need cash. So how are we going to get cash if it doesn't pay the private banks to be in these areas? And that's where a national form of money comes in. You should have basically ATMs, which are British Central Bank ATMs, maybe even a special note emblazoned with British Central Bank, which is British currency. And it's not a private bank, so it doesn't need to make a profit, but it does provide the people with the means of exchange that we so desperately need. So I'm going to develop that idea. It's actually 2 books, but the first book is going to be a best of my previous articles that I've written on all of this in the past, which are now unfortunately lost to the internet, but which I've still got here on the computer and can be put back into some form. Anyway, folks, starting a couple of minutes later, we have our good friend Avellina Balestri, who is going to join us right now all the way from Maryland. Please say hello to Avellina.
Hello, Alistair.
Good evening.
Company. Good evening. Looking forward to your book coming out on the referendum, because I know that's how we all met. You, me, Ian Inkster, Duncan McIntyre. So it'll be really fun to be able to read your reflections on that.
Yes, indeed. How are things in Maryland this evening? Is it what time is it over there? I always ask you.
It is 2:33. So we are at 5 hours behind you, I believe. When sometimes there's that weird little thing where when there's the daylight savings time for one or another of us sort of moves, sooner than the other, and then it shifts. But usually we are 5 hours behind on the East Coast of the United States.
Excellent. Well, thanks for coming back in again. You had an idea to develop your historic series now. You've given several very good interviews with us regarding the British soldiers who fought for the British side during the French and Indian Wars and also the American War of Independence. And you're bringing it a little bit closer to home for us on this side of the pond tonight. And
yes.
Yes, so you're speaking about Colonel John Gardiner. Now, my understanding, James, and could you just take this from the beginning, because this is like the 1745 Jacobite British conflict, and just kind of give us some background on what that conflict was about. That's the Gardiner chap right there.
Sure. So in brief, because I could go on forever about the 45, it's one of my hobby horses, so I'll try to keep this very truncated. Essentially, the Jacobite rebellions were dynastic conflicts for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to, I could go into everything, but essentially, James II was exiled from Britain, in large part due to his Catholic faith and because he was trying to essentially offer religious toleration for Catholics and various types of dissenting Protestants. And that ended up clashing with, various Anglicans and various other groups who didn't much like that. There were other elements involved, though, as well. because James, for example, was allied with France, versus people who were very, opposed to Louis XIV's expansions. And so you have eventually William of Orange, and his wife, who's James's daughter, Mary II. They take the throne in what is known as the Glorious Revolution in 1688. And then subsequently, so they're Protestants, and so you have this, it's not a strict, it's complicated because it's not a strict religious divide in terms of who's on what side. So, for example, a lot of people think in their minds, oh, so it's Catholic versus Protestant. Well, it's a little trickier than that, because you have a lot of Protestants actually on the side of James, and his descendants, who then come back to claim the throne in the Jacobite rebellions. Jacobite meaning essentially James supporters. And they would then support his son, James Francis Stuart, and then James Francis's son, Charles Edward Stuart, in their claims for the throne. So suffice to say, you had plenty of Protestants doing that, but at the same time, you had Catholic powers allied with William of Orange, for example, in his efforts to put a halt to Louis XIV's expansion. So when he went over and did his essential bloodless coup conquest thing, it wasn't completely bloodless because of the battles that happened subsequently, but it's kind of remembered as bloodless. You had various Catholic powers actually, ironically, saying mass for him, and you even had the Holy See, so the Pope in Rome, kind of giving him the thumbs up because his lands were also in danger by Louis. So it was beneficial for all of them that William wins. So it was a complicated thing, is my point. So
yes,
fast forward, you got,
yeah, you find that in all wars, that it might just seem it's like black v white or something, but there's actually lots of different groups have got their own particular interests in seeing one side dominate another side, which might be an interest that really has got nothing to do with even what seems to be the central conflict.
Exactly.
So that's just the nature of war.
Absolutely. And that was the case in each one of the subsequent Jacobite risings that occurred. So the one that we're focusing on currently, because of Gardiner's role in it, is the 1745 Jacobite Rebellion, which is by far the most famous, because it's the one that really is remembered through romantic storytelling and song. The last one that, again, it's just commemorated in so many different ways that it Outlander has made it, very popular among some, viewers, for example, who may not be history buffs, but they will have watched that program and they'll remember it from there. But suffice to say, this is when Charles Edward Stuart, so Bonnie Prince Charlie, or the Young Pretender, called by those who were not as in favor of him, comes over to Scotland and tries to retake the triple crown, essentially, of England, Scotland, and Ireland. And so he has his uprising. He lands up in the north. He marches down through the Highlands. He collects support for himself, gets down to the lowlands, and he ends up taking Edinburgh, which was a rather largely Hanoverian city, actually. So Hanoverian being those pro the House of Hanover. So real quick, you basically have, after William and Mary die, they're succeeded by Mary's sister Anne. Then when she dies, the crown passes over to her Protestant cousins from Germany, the House of Hanover. So that's where you get the many Georges that come to power. And so at this point in time, so they're skipping over essentially the Catholic line. That's what they're doing. They're doing kind of a circumvention where it's like, we're not going to have you guys because you guys are Catholic, so we're going to give it to the Protestant distant cousins. So at this point in time, it's George II who is in command of this shebang when the 45 occurs and Charles Edward comes over and so forth. So basically, you do, though, and this is an important distinction, because this conflict has been so badly co-opted by nationalists, that it is made into this England versus Scotland conflict a lot in popular culture, and that just simply was not the case whatsoever. You have many, many Scots who either were outright pro the House of Hanover, or they were neutral. You did, a minority, frankly, given all of that, were pro-Jacobite. So really, it isn't what it's set up to be. But so then this story here is a perfect case scenario for it, because tonight we'll be focusing on a Scottish gentleman who died fighting for the House of Hanover. And this is Colonel James Gardiner. So Gardiner started off his military career when he was very young, like when he was around 14 or so. And he served very briefly as a mercenary for the Dutch. And even though this would later go on to, like I mentioned when I did my episode on General Simon Fraser of Balmain, that mercenary service could be frowned upon, but it depended what time period you were in. So when it comes to Jacobites, or people from clans that were semi-Jacobite, or Highland clans or whatnot, or even split, like Fraser, they would use that against them, like, oh, they went and they served in mercenary capacity, and they would kind of use it as a negative. But you can see throughout history, plenty of people did stints in other armies in this time period, especially, and this is the case with Gardiner, and why he doesn't get any flack for this, is because this is the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution. And what is that about? It's about a Dutchman becoming the king of the Triple Kingdoms. So literally serving in the Dutch army for a little while was no big deal in this capacity. So when he's very young, he serves for a year in the Dutch army, about a year and a half, something like that. And then he ends up serving under Queen Anne. So he goes, this is prior to the Act of Union, right? So in the War of Spanish Succession, everything is a little wibbly wobbly in terms of what is going to very, very shortly hereafter become the British Army proper. But so you have Scotsmen and Englishmen, though. I almost feel like it's fair to say that the British Union began with the military before it began with the parliaments, in a way. Because on a practical level, like in the War of Spanish Succession, you had the forming of the British Army before it was even officially formed, if you want to put it that way. You had Englishmen and Scotsmen, for example, working so closely together. So,
good point.
It was almost as if, like, the army under Marlborough practically was unifying even before the unification officially happened. Marlborough is a major figure in that, and we could do a whole episode on him separately because he's awesome, but that's another thing for another day. So suffice to say,
yeah, I'd like to do that. Thinking about it, what you were saying there about the Scottish soldiers. There were Scottish soldiers fighting for Marlborough's army.
Oh yes,
and the Scottish Parliament, I made a Facebook post about this the other day. Actually, the Scottish Parliament said that they would take the soldiers out of Marlborough's army if the English Parliament at the time didn't allow a Scottish Act to be passed. But what was it? It was the Scots wanted their own act of settlement, but the English were like, no, we don't. We've decided it's going to be a Protestant, and the Scots were, we do want it to be a Protestant as well, but we want to be able to decide if we disagree with you. If you pick the different one, we want another one if we don't like the one that you pick. And there was this big carry on about it, and the Scots were going to take the soldiers out of the Marlborough's army, and so the Queen Anne, or at least her governor, capitulated and said, okay, you get your way. You can have your particular act of security, as we called it. The English called it the Act of Settlement. We called it the Act of Security. Both essentially the same things,
right?
But yeah, that was all to do with the Scots in Marlborough's army being used.
Oh yeah, because it was a very trick. Because when you think about it, it's like, for example, the Earl of Stair. He was essentially an aide of Marlborough, a very famous Scotsman. So this wasn't even just, it wasn't just lower figure Scots. These were high ranking Scots who were in the army. Because when you look at, it it was a very interesting time. Like you said, it was very interesting because you have these various acts and assertions of, are we separate things completely, or are we kind of like meshing in some way, or how much are we meshing? What are we giving up? What aren't we giving up? Are we distinct? How long will we be completely distinct? Or are we ever completely distinct? Because like when you read even, I was reading the Life and Letters of Samuel Rutherford recently, a very famous Presbyterian divine from the 1600s, from the era of the War of the Three Kingdoms. And this is a man who is referencing Britain as a whole very often. And so there was an understanding of it on some level, that they were all part of the same island and they were joined by fate in a certain way. They'd been joined by the crowns. Inevitably, they were joined by destiny, essentially. I mean, after a while, they were starting to refer to themselves as a single unit, even though there was these. So the point is, yes, all of this was going on at the same time. So you have Gardiner coming in on this, where he was part of a lot of Scots who were indeed serving in this military. You have it with the Covenanter Regiment, as I mentioned under Major Pitcairn's episode, that his dad was a chaplain for, that served under Marlborough, and all of this stuff. So it was very much on the cusp of the Union, I would say. These are like the final years, you might say, the final decade prior to when it finally kind of comes together. So it was a lot of different tugging going on of pros and cons, and what do we keep and what do we lose, and is it going to happen, and it's pulling for it happening, kind of thing. So anyway, Gardiner, he gets shot in the mouth at Ramillies. So he gets badly injured. This when he's like 15. He nearly gets killed by a scavenger. He gets rescued by a nun, of all things. And then, so he gets kind of patched up and taken care of. And she tries to convert him to Catholicism. But even though he has no interest in religion, he kind of has ethno-Protestantism going for him. So he's like, nah, thank you, no, but I'm not really religious, period. So then he goes on in life. He serves in various capacities, and he tends to live a fairly dissolute kind of early life, and just sort of likes the wine, women, and song going on about it. And then and is stationed in various parts of Europe during this time in his career. This is, again, post-Union at this point. So nowadays, officially, the British Army has come together as an entity. And so one of the most famous incidences that happens in his life is that when he is prepping, essentially, to meet up with this married woman in this romantic rendezvous, he is trying to kill some time while he's waiting for her. And so he ends up reading his book, which his pious mother packed him in his luggage, called The Christian Soldier by the Puritan divine Thomas Watson. And so he's reading this sort of, again, to pass the time. And then he, as he recorded it, saw this light fall on the pages, and he thought it was the taper sort of flaring on the sort of end table nearby. And then he turns, and he has this dream vision type of thing of the crucified Christ, who says to him, "O sinner, have I suffered all this for thee, and these are the returns." So Gardiner gets very affected by this experience and turns around his life, becomes very pious, becomes famously pious figure. Famously renowned in Presbyterian circles, was quite a sort of, it became like a source of emulation in Presbyterian circles this time. So he, very, very much is kind of dealing with the aftermath of that experience, kind of his whole life, you might say, because he continues to have and record these visions and ecstasies and dreams and so forth, and in his writings and so forth, as he's continuing his military career, which makes him a very fascinating character. He almost falls into this sort of type of the warrior mystic due to these things. So it's really interesting that way. And I'm just looking at my notes because there's a lot on Gardiner. Like, you could just go on forever on Gardiner. But
bring us.
Yeah.
We've got about 5 minutes or so. Bring us to the big battle then that he is probably later in his career and is unfortunately the final one for him.
Sure. So as mentioned, he's a Hanoverian. He's a Presbyterian. He's serving in the regular army, and so he, for a long time, has sort of worried about this rebellion. He thinks the rebellion is going to happen, and he essentially believes that this is going to be kind of a chastisement on a sinful land. And so he talks a lot about having exhausted himself with strong cries and tears, which he poured out until he was hardly able to stand when he arose from his knees. And so he was foreshadowing that there was going to be bad things going to hit the country, and he believed it was sort of a chastisement on it. So, but he's determined essentially to, he basically says at one point, he thinks he's going to die. He kind of thinks he's going to die from the beginning. But he says he's willing to sacrifice himself for the security of the country, and he doesn't fear dying. He doesn't fear fighting. He only fears sinning. So this was his famous line. He goes into it, and he serves under Sir John Cope. So he becomes famous for "Hey Johnny Cope, Where You Walking Yet" song. Poor Cope. I could get a whole thing on him too. I feel a little bit bad for him. I think he gets a bit harshly treated. But shall we just say Gardiner and Cope didn't really see eye to eye on how to do how to combat the Jacobite threat. They didn't see eye to eye. Gardiner really does feel like Cope isn't handling it right when they're going toward Prestonpans. So effectively, Prestonpans, it was a great Jacobite victory. It was a big Jacobite high, and the floor gets kind of wiped with, Team Hanover. And so Cope does try to rally his troops, and he famously tells them, tries to rally them saying, behave like Britons, and so forth. And, but everybody was kind of freaked because they're being the recipients of the Highland charge. And that was pretty terrifying. And I mean, this is worth another mention that, Lowlanders were actually more likely to dread and be afraid of Highlanders than the English. Like when we think about the English versus the Scots, we have this cartoonish version of what Scotland was, and they're all Highlanders technically. Like the Lowlanders were a different group of people. They were just different, and they felt very different to their Highland, counterparts who were different in many, many ways. Language, oftentimes religion, they tended to be more Catholic and Scottish Episcopalian, whereas the Lowlanders tended to be more Presbyterian. That could vary, obviously, but that's generally speaking. And in dress, in manners, in culture, in what they felt comfortable doing in terms of casual violence. So there was a lot of different things, and the Highlanders were terrifying. They were totally terrifying, especially the Lowlanders, which freaked the heck out by these people. So Gardiner, though, because he's pretty awesome himself, is kind of like, all right, we're being, attacked by Highlanders, and they're freaking terrifying, but we're gonna hold together here. So Gardiner, as it says, Gardiner fought and fighting fell. So essentially he would not get off the field. He would refuse to get off the field. He kept fighting until he was shot roughly 4 times and then hit in the head with a Lochaber axe. Because did we ever mention in this series of Scottish soldiers I've been presenting, Scots can't just die. These guys cannot just die. They need to have something extra happen before they can die. So all this happens to him, and he should be dead. He's not, though. So you basically have his manservant eventually finds him, prostrate under a thorn tree, which becomes this whole, allegorical and religiously symbolic thing. And so then he ends up taken to essentially a church manse where he is nursed, rather ironically, by 2 Jacobite sympathizing young ladies, not terribly far from his own home. He was married with many children himself. Makes it rather tragic. But he was quite close. It was his own turf. He was a lowland Scot, and he was very near to the place where this thing was fought. And so he dies there. And that's where, you know, you basically have the monument that is there to him currently.
Yes, we've got a picture here at Bankton House in Prestonpans. There is a memorial to him, and there it is there. And I don't know to what extent you can see it from the picture, but there's 4 sleeping lions at each of the 4 corners of that obelisk, and I had not been aware of it until researching the matter. I had not been aware of this man until today, actually.
A bit tragic, because he was, you know, quite a famous figure, you know, at the time, for sure. And I actually had him included in my American Revolution novel by way of Major John Pitcairn telling his story, because Pitcairn came from the same general area of Scotland, comes from this very strong Presbyterian family, his dad being, you know, a Covenanter style moderator and so forth. So I had him just tell the tale, because I really wanted to, you know, get it in there, and he was such a famous figure at the time.
So that's presumably him in this picture here.
It is, yes. Being awesome. And
I wouldn't like to be stuck in the middle of that.
I know we're running low on time, so what I'll do is quickly just read a quote from him, and a quote from the book he was reading. So I mean, Gardiner was fairly prolific. Anybody who wants to look up his stuff, I highly recommend it. Quite a good read to get a sense of the era, both as a military man, but also the religious tone of the era for especially like pious Presbyterians, but also just in general Christianity of the era and its expression in the British Isles. Highly recommend it. So like track down his letters by all means. Just type it in. Google has them there for free. But anyway, I'll just read 2 bits. I know we're running out. So this is from him. I think I can bear anything, the loss of all, the loss of health, of relations, on whom I depend and whom I love, all that is dear to me without repining or murmuring. When I think that God orders, disposes, and manages all things according to the counsel of his own will, when I think of the extent of his providences, that it reaches to the minutest things, then, though a useful friend or dear relative be snatched away by death, I recall myself and check my thoughts with these considerations. Is he not God from everlasting and to everlasting? And has he not promised to be a God to me, a God in all his attributes, a God in all his persons, a God in all his creatures and providences? And this was immediately before Prestonpans. This line he was writing to a friend when he still, nothing bad had happened yet. But he was saying, I have been very busy, hurried about from place to place. But blessed be God, all is over without bloodshed. And pray let me ask, what made you show so much concern for me in your last? Were you afraid I should get to heaven before you? Or can any evil befall those who are followers of that which is good? And then lastly, this is from the book he was reading when he had his fateful epiphany conversion moment, from Thomas Watson, again, the Puritan divine, who's also a very fascinating character from out of British religious literature. But it sums up Gardiner extremely well, I think, and would go on to define everything about him going forward from that point. A Christian fights the Lord's battles. He is Christ's ensign bearer. Now, what though he endures hard fate and the bullets fly around? He fights for a crown. And this ties in very much from the legend that when Gardiner was laying on the ground mortally wounded, some Jacobites were around him, and Gardiner essentially says, you've come here to fight for your prince, or something like that. Your prince has come here to fight for your crown. Well, I have already gained a crown. So that kind of ties in, and the thorn tree also ties in with the imagery of crowns as well in Christian martyrology tradition. So that was Gardiner, and that is his legacy in that.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to fire his name up here for people. James Gardiner.
Gardiner. This one says Gardiner.
Does it? Oh, Gardiner. That's fine. I fired it up too quickly.
It's James and then Gardiner.
Yeah, that's my hay fever. Sorry.
No worries. I live on a farm, you see. So why should why should we be cowed by mere hay when we have predecessors uncowed by bullets? No, hay is worse than bullets. We should be cowed by it. If there's anything we should be cowed by, it's hay.
Avellina, you've been very entertaining tonight. Thanks very much for introducing us to another lost Scotsman that many of us had never heard about, and who's famous enough to have his own memorial as well.
The lost shall be found.
That's right. Anybody wants to find out more about you, go to your youtube.com/@Avellina Balestri. That's AVELLINA BALESTRI for the benefit of those listening on audio only. And we'll have you back. And there's countless people. Johnny Cope, you mentioned there. Marlborough, crikey, he could take up several issues.
Here's a thought. Here's a thought I have. I think it would be fun to do Sir Hugh Mackay, because he's in the same realm of the general Glorious Revolution Jacobite period, and he's also a Scotsman who served with the Dutch a bit. And so I think it would be fun to do him as follow-up.
Let's do it. We'll make a date for sometime later this year or whenever suits your fancy, Avellina. But in the meantime, have a lovely afternoon over there in Maryland. And thanks once again for coming back on.
Thank you for having me on. God bless. Thank you.
You're welcome. Fantastic, folks. Say thanks to our friend Avellina there. Christopher says, thank you, Avellina, as does Oksana and Rafa. And thank you, sir. We must get you on, Preston Journalist. Must get you on these days. Good stuff. Excellent. Well, we're going to have guests for the next 2 or 3 weeks. We've got a guest on next week. I'm glad to say it'll be Damien. And in the meantime, folks, please do check out, if you haven't got it already, please go to, nice to see we say it in the house. Please, let's remove that banner. Please go to amazon.co.uk and just type in Protect Our Country, and you'll get this book and 315 pages of solutions, a work of art, as one of our customers said to us. It's subtitled Policies to Stop Mass Immigration, and it's the second in our Big Book for the Union series. And what I think about this book is it's just sensible stuff. I was watching somebody who's got a big following on the internet, on Twitter last night, and they were saying stuff which is just not likely. It's like, oh, we have to send these people to Ascension Island. That's never going to happen. So don't say stuff that's just silly stuff, you know. What can literally be done in reality? There's a lot that can still be done without going to the, let's send them to the South Sandwich Islands, you know. And there's a lot that can be done, workable, practical, sensible policies that can stop not just the levels of channel crossing, but to stop the massive numbers of legal immigrants who are coming in. And legal immigration is very easily sorted. You simply just control the visas, whether it's for work or study or family reunion. And you can put out 1 million visas, or you can say there's going to be no visas. And if you have no visas, then nobody gets into the country via the legal means, airports, ports of entry. and so on and so forth. So it can all be easily done. And we just, this is like a bringing people back to reality. Here's what can be done. And don't think that your politicians know about this. I read some of the people, I won't mention any names, but cabinet members. And I think to myself, I don't think they know how the system operates. Like, I don't think they know how the UN Refugee Convention works. I've got a degree in Scots law. I've spent many years studying it. I know how it works exactly. And it's not really how many people would think. And we show what's the problem with it here. And we show the little things that need to be done to make it work. Indeed, to make it work, we have to leave it, because it really is the critical convention that messes up our country, the UN Refugee Convention. And so there's no way we can stop the boats without leaving the UN Refugee Convention. And that's a big, serious takeaway from this book, even though we only cover it in 2 of the 19 chapters. So some of you may think, well, I'm not going to read 315 pages, but I think my MP should at least know about this. So why don't you just simply buy it when it comes, send it to your MP, and maybe point out 1 or 2 of the chapter headings for your MP or his or her office to look at. Because we here at A Force for Good, we don't have the money to send copies to even the whole of the cabinet. But if you think that there's an MP who should see this, then just buy a copy and send it to them, even though you yourself might not actually be reading the book. Because we need to get this information into the hands of as many legislators as possible, so that it can at least give them ideas that they can then articulate. And as I say in the book, I'm not wanting any recognition for any of this, not that I would expect any. I'm just wanting people to use these ideas in whatever way they think best, people who are much better placed than I am. So if you can help get books like this book specifically, into the hands of MPs, cabinet members, MSPs as well, leaders of the Scottish political parties, within reason, obviously, send this to a Green person. Send this to Patrick Harvey. He'll probably send it to the police and say, can you get Alistair McConnachie on anything that's in here, please? But, you know, reasonable politicians that you can think of, send them this copy. Let's get it circulating among those who can make what's in here happen. And as I say, it's all just very sensible, workable, serious politics. There's nothing in here about sending people to Ascension Island or imprisoning them in St. Georgia along with the penguins. You know, there's nothing like that in here at all. This is the most sensible read you will have ever read on this matter. And as I like to say, it was 1 year in the writing, 25 years in the making. And folks, check it out. Now, on that serious note, Derek says it's all been very interesting. Thank you, Derek. Always nice to see you in every week. Paul Hadlow says, great guest, needed another half hour. Absolutely. Christopher says, more knowledge gained as usual here. That's the aim. James says, enjoyed the show. Christopher says, we should send a copy to Rupert Lowe. Our office did take the opportunity to send Rupert Lowe a copy. We've sent to about 4 politicians, Rupert Lowe, or at least Rupert Lowe's team, Nigel Farage's team. We sent one to Suella Braverman. I mean, I thought, is it worth the postage? But we sent one anyway, because I'm pretty sure she doesn't know how the UN Refugee Convention actually works. I know that's ridiculous, but I don't think she does. Because if she did, she would not be saying things that she's saying. She's concentrating on ECHR. ECHR is a bit player. It's a secondary player. The main one is the UN Refugee Convention. That's what legalizes the traffic into the UK. The The ECHR only kicks in for a small number of people who can claim a family right to stay. And it's usually after 2 or 3 years of them being in this country. And that's for a minority. It's the UN Refugee Convention, which is the big one. Oh, thank you, Rafa. Alistair McConnachie is a real British patriot and Scottish unionist. And you sound like a great chap yourself, Rafa. One copy for the self, one for someone else, says Christopher. James says, everyone in the SNP needs to read it. Absolutely, they actually do, because I hold out hope that there are still some intelligent people left, if not elected to high position, at least in the membership. And I know that for a fact, because I know 2 or 3 of them who will very much appreciate this and who really need to get these ideas circulating within the SNP. Because the SNP is meant to be for the Scottish nation. Okay, it's not meant to be for the world. It's meant to be for the Scottish nation. So if they are true Scottish nationalists, they should be interested in how do we protect Scotland. There are several Labour cabinet ministers that we have identified, Oksana, that should get it, and also some Labour MPs who should get it, especially Red Wall Labour MPs who need good advice. And yeah, we're on it, but we can't send to them all, unfortunately. But we can certainly tell people who we would like. If somebody says, I bought 10 copies, who should I send them to? We can give you the names. Who is the 4th person? Let me find out who the 4th person was. There wasn't a 4th person. There wasn't a 4th MP. There wasn't a 4th MP. Not yet, anyway. Okay, folks, we're going to be back next week. Thank you for everything, for all the comments. Really busy show tonight. We'll be back with our guest Damien Davies next week, and we look forward to seeing you then. So in the meantime, it just remains for me to say, God bless the United Kingdom and God save the King. See you next week.